Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second session of the Exeter Integration Conference. And I just wanted to start out by also thanking funders because this conference is partly supported by the Society and Cultures Institute at the University of Exeter, a small grant awarded to Christine and me. So the title of this session is Integration in Clinical Practice, which is a topic that I'm very interested in. I think, as you probably saw from Leo's workshop, or the feelings that we experience, that actually integration's a kind of life's work, and so it's quite hard to think of how we weave that into some of the clinical practices. But we know that psychedelics and this kind of way of practicing is being used in clinical settings, and so it's really important to think about how that might work. And I'm really delighted to welcome an incredible panel of speakers. Geoff Bathje, he's come over from the US, as has Paul, and I think they'll introduce themselves a bit more. And our last minute addition, who was, so the panel has been very fluid, who's very bravely come. She's just recovering from an ICPR-induced illness, so has come to talk to us today. So I think it'll be a really fascinating panel. And from my side, I got interested in this topic, and Christine and I started talking about it, really because I'm quite a newcomer to integration. I've been working with principally ketamine, and in that world, there wasn't a lot of chat of integration. There wasn't even a lot of chat of therapy, really. When we ran our first trial of adjunctive ketamine to psychological therapy, people thought that was weird enough to put therapy in it, let alone talk about integration. And it's something that's really come out of the psychedelic world. But it is really, really important, clearly, and something that happened after our first trial. A lot of participants came forward and said that they wanted an opportunity to share their experiences with other people. And so we and other people said to me, oh, you're not integrating people, that's unethical. But I looked at the kind of what integration was available in clinical trials, and it is a really tricky one, I think, because in a clinical trial, you have such a short time frame with which to work with people. And so some of the integration happened quite quickly after the experience. And I think that's something we need to know more about, is the kind of time course of the integration process. And also, how best to do it. I mean, I'm really lucky to be joined by a lot of therapists from our new trial. And in this phase 3 study that we're running across the UK with the same kind of ketamine-assisted model, we're looking at using a sort of peer support group at 6 months as part of the integration process. And hopefully that'll be something that's ongoing. But I'm hoping that we'll be informed by hearing from the very esteemed speakers today to potentially adjust our practice there. So I'll hand over for an introduction to what integration is. So Geoff.
Can you hear me okay? Good, okay. Okay, so my name is Geoff Bathje, and I have been a professor, a researcher, also dabbled in things like community organizing, activism, and policy work. So coming at this from a bunch of different angles, and I'll try to cover some of those in the talk here today. Just a warning, I've been having a bit of allergies, and I don't know if I got the antihistamine to caffeine ratio right this morning, but I'll do my best. Okay, so this is the article I'll be referencing, which some of you might be familiar with. That was a synthesis and concept analysis of all the writing that had been done on psychedelic integration up until second half of 2022 when it published. This has also been adapted, if you're interested, for clinical practice into a website and a workbook on MAP's website. But you can look that up, it's open access. So first, just a little bit of background context. When I first started doing integration work in practice, sometimes people would ask, is this a legitimate therapy? Is this something totally experimental? And I do think integration is a concept that has been around for a while. The earliest reference I can find to it is Pierre Genet, 1889, who was a trauma therapist and whose work still impacts how we think about dissociation. He was a somatic therapist. Predecessor of Freud plagiarized him, actually. And so he defined traumatization as a failure of integrative capacity with the goal of therapy, restoration of the balance of the integrative experience, the ability to integrate new information and experiences. So in some ways, some overlap even with our modern way of thinking about it. Educational psychology has long recognized that we have a consolidation period between when we learn something and we become proficient at it and can actually apply it, right? So they don't use the word integration much from what I can see, but it's there. And then if we look back at the history of analytic therapy and the sheer number of hours and repetition that were in the early analytic therapies, as we move to a short-term model, maybe we've lost some of the importance of integration there. That maybe happened on its own a lot through repetition back in the day. Yet still a lot of therapists will incorporate various forms of homework, which I think do support integration. So I think the concept is all over the field of psychotherapy, education, even if it hasn't always been called that. And so we tried to synthesize a definition of integration. For this article, we looked at 20-some definitions of integration that were out there. Everyone kind of working in their own silos, and we came to this fairly lengthy definition, but I think it captures a complex topic fairly well. So integration being a process, very important. So a process in which a person revisits and actively engages in making sense of, working through, translating, and processing the content of their psychedelic experience. And then through an intentional effort and support in that practice, it allows one to gradually capture and incorporate the emergent lessons and insight into their lives. So that part being important too, that this in some way is transformative, comes forward into your life in some way, moves us then towards balance and wholeness along a bunch of different domains. And I'll point to those in a model that we came to in a minute here. There's that. So this model wasn't something we invented, but was the attempt to synthesize 10 different frameworks, models, approaches to integration that we found in the literature. When I started thinking about this project in about 2017, it was because in my own training, there was a lot of questions around what is integration? How do you do it? There's a sense that it's important, but we don't really know what it is or why you would recommend one or the other of these various practices to somebody to help their integration. And then seems like a lot of other people were asking that same question, because in 2017, the first book focused totally on integration that I'm aware of was published. But the other 9 models, I think all the rest of them were published in the last 5 years. So then we went from kind of a deficit of information around integration to a flood of information, everybody working in their own silos, which I think caused a different sort of confusion. And so the goal here was to kind of pull that together in a way to say, how are people thinking about this? How are people working with it? This is intended to be a holistic model. So you had these 6 domains at the center of the hexagon. And so the idea being that these aren't separate, that these are different aspects of our experience, our mental, emotional, contemplative capacities, our body and somatic experience, spiritual, existential, ritual practices, beliefs, our connection to the natural world, our relationships and sense of community, and then our lifestyle and actions. And so there might have been a few other things, and I'll give you an additional model you can think about with this that I would have put in here if I were starting from scratch, but we were trying to synthesize what had been written rather than invent something new. And then you have this outer ring of different continuum on which you can think about integrative practices so that people can also choose a balance of what they're doing, things that are more passive, things that are more actively engaging that process, for example. And so the goal here then is a balance of attention to the different domains. And you might have already, as you're looking at this, realized you could kind of use this as a bit of an assessment too, right? So for any of these domains, you can ask, where am I giving more attention? What am I giving less attention to in my integration? And then it's not just the balance between them, but the relationships between them. So at what point are there tensions between these areas? At what points are they complementary? So an example I might give is if we think about the natural world and environmental threats that we're experiencing globally, how does that impact our emotional state? How does that impact our emotional well-being? How do contaminants and things in the environment impact the body and our somatic experience? How do those interact to impact our communities, our spiritual development, right? So you can take any two or more of these and think about them in relation to each other and how they either help or hinder, or so where they're out of balance, where there's dissonance, or where there's synergy. Let's see. And so I did want to note that a number of these authors talked about being inspired by indigenous wellness practices. As far as I know from looking at their bios, none of the authors that we relied on identify as indigenous themselves. So that could be a gap, but just wanted to comment on that as well. We also reviewed a giant list of integrative practices. If you look at the online version of this article rather than the PDF, that can be easy to miss. But there were more than 120 or so different specific practices that were recommended to support integration. These were the themes and categories that we identified those as falling within. So again, I sometimes will ask clients to look at that list before they even come to the psychedelic experience as part of their preparation. What are the practices they're already engaged in? What are the ways that they already prefer to process things? And then what are the things that might challenge them in new areas that aren't getting as much attention? So that can be a helpful process going into the experience as they're planning to make some space and time for integration. So I won't go into that too much because it's a giant list, but can give people ideas. So kind of expanding beyond that model and that synthesis of information. The one thing that wasn't quite captured here was thinking kind of politically and contextually beyond the person and the things that immediately are part of their experience. And so this isn't the only model, but I like Bronfenbrenner's ecological model as a way of thinking of the person within context and within systems, if you're not familiar with it. So we have the developing child in the center here, all the more immediate or proximal things that impact them, like their family, their community, maybe their religious community, friends, workplace of the parents. And then those are all situated within additional larger contexts, right? So we move out to the laws, the education system, the type of political system, the type of economy, that these all impact those relationships and the choices that people have available to them. And then beyond that, we have the macro system, the norms and values of the culture, things like racism, patriarchy, broader isms can fall under there. But also just the worldviews of that culture. And then this all exists over time and is impacted by historical influences. So things like growing up during a pandemic or a war or things like that. All right, so this kind of gets us even further out beyond the individual. Looking at a model like this is intended to contradict some of the neoliberal sense of individualism, which is so prevalent in Western culture, that these systems are always present for us, always interacting with each other, and that those impact the health and wellness of the people, where we just perceive ourselves as the individual and maybe take on a lot of responsibility for how we're feeling, but it has a context, and our options are partly defined within that context. So particularly coming from the United States, where these neoliberal beliefs have been propagandized and intended to very much bury and suppress the collectivist movements of the 1960s and 70s. It can be really difficult even to hold your thought beyond the individual level. And so in therapy, we're often bringing in what I think are not the most helpful individualistic ideas, promoting things like rigid boundaries over relationships and community building. And so in ways that can kind of isolate people further, rather than encourage them to learn how to work constructively with other people. And so then it's important to reflect on how we might have the freedom to integrate the insights and experiences that we have based on all this context. And so one example of that would be if you work with somebody who's very wealthy, they might have the ability to abruptly go and open a retreat center in another country. And so you might have to encourage them to slow down for their integration process. Somebody who doesn't have as many resources might have things where they want to make a big shift, but they just don't have the means to do that. It's going to be more of an incremental and gradual approach given the restrictions of their context. And so you might have to work with a person to be more patient and systematic at how they go about doing their integration as far as bringing things into their life. Makes sense. Yeah. Okay. And so if we contrast this model, which is intended to be very holistic and balanced wellness model, if I were to try to depict the standard Western mind, I think it's marked by a lot of fragmentation and dualisms and objectification. And so we might identify ourselves primarily as a mind who is in ownership of a body, which we do like rent out for things like labor. And we engage in behaviors generally out of some sort of necessity or pleasure. We have these dialectics between self and other, between person and nature, a lot of other dialectics. And so these other things become kind of objects, they become objectified and outside of ourselves. And some more to note, if this is kind of the basis of the culture, we built a medical model out of that culture, and the medical model helped to construct that culture as well. And so that model often we will tend to either mind or behavior or body, usually not all of those things. And we usually don't have a whole lot of interest or knowledge about what to do about these other things if they're impacting a person, right? So we're working within a model that's kind of fragmented and provides some challenges. So then we have these non-ordinary states of consciousness, as we call them, that might really disrupt all of that and get us more in touch with a holistic sense of self, to where we have things like an interesting mind-body experience. And so we often use the phrase ordinary state of consciousness to refer to our day-to-day, right? And Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, wrote about a psychopathology of the average in Western cultures. And so at the top of that pyramid was self-actualization, but Maslow also wrote a bit about the ways that the culture itself could get in the way of people being able to engage in self-actualization or accomplish that. And so we are kind of chronically in this paternalistic state of deference to different systems, to nation states, to corporations and capitalism. We, because of that dependence, it kind of assures we won't resist a whole lot, at least in dramatic ways. And so that enables inequalities of power and wealth that can kind of get in the way of our individual integration that we're attempting to accomplish. Yeah, so this leaves us vulnerable. Karl Marx had a theory called alienation theory, which was not really well elaborated. Maybe Erich Fromm was the one who best elaborated it in some of his psychological work. And so out of that sense of dependence, some have used the word domestication. We're often kind of lacking in our survival skills, unable to pursue our instincts that we might get in touch with through psychedelic experience, and then have a lot of trouble integrating as a result. And so can have an impact on our mental health, leave us in a chronic state of being disturbed or labeled as ill, when in fact that has a larger social context, as I'm proposing here, right? It's not just about the deficits within the person, even if the suffering is experienced within the person. And just want to point out, so going back to the indigenous thought here, that the indigenous critiques of lack of freedom, collectivism, and egalitarianism date back quite a ways. So it's coming up again in our current psychedelic renaissance, but also seem to have an impact the first time around as Europeans ran into indigenous thought. So it had a role in the European Enlightenment and Renaissance. Great book by David Graeber and Wengrow called thank you. I didn't write it, but called The Dawn of Everything, that goes into some of that history. So another question that often comes up is, why do Westerners need integration, with the implication that indigenous people seem not to need a formal integration process as much? And so I want to make clear that all life forms, all beings require an adequate balance of the essential ingredients of their existence in order to thrive. So if we go back to this model, for a plant, it might be not these items, it might be things like soil and nutrients and water and air and sunlight. So it's a little bit simpler, but still plants need an integration of all those conditions of their existence if they're going to survive. If any of them are out of balance or lacking, they may not survive, or at least will not be thriving, right? And so humans in that sense are no different in their context, just maybe more complex. Outside of Western medicine, there's a pretty universal recognition of the need to attune to balance and holism throughout the lifetime as a daily practice. So pattern thinking is learned, systems thinking is learned from an early age. Attunement to the social network is learned from an early age. And so one of the ideas being then that indigenous people might just have a more holistic system, whereas we have an illness-based system, right? So what is wellness in Western medicine? It's the absence of illness. It's just negatively defined, right? Whereas indigenous models are wellness models with a lot of emphasis on balance and integration. And so another reason why Westerners might need integration is we're often, as you might be surmising here, coming to these experiences pretty disintegrated in the first place, approaching the psychedelic experience with pretty narrow goals. So I did another qualitative study a few years ago where I talked to Westerners who were traveling to shamanic contexts for ayahuasca experiences. We asked them what their intention was going in. It was almost always for a diagnosis. And then we asked them what happened, what was the impact of that experience, and it was always much, much broader than a diagnosis. So we're coming in unprepared for the breadth and the depth of the experiences we're having, and then we may not have much of a framework to work with all aspects of that experience in an integrative way. And so I think we're kind of disadvantaged in doing our integration from the models we come in with to how we approach it to how we work with it afterwards. And so from this standpoint, then I propose that psychedelics are not so much creating the disturbance or the rupture, that was a great word that Leo used, not so much creating that as they are highlighting the disturbances and ruptures and imbalances that are pre-existing as a condition of our place in our cultural position. So I do still think I'm not of the opinion that we need to ban the use of psychedelics in medicine or interfere with that, as some are advocating for. I do think psychedelics within a medical model can have help with specific psychological pain points, traumas, problems in childhood and upbringing. I think it can help resolve those things in interesting ways. But I do think we need a substantial revision to those models to promote prevention, wellness, and thriving. And so I am kind of excited to see psychedelics come into a medical model just to see what it will do to the medical model. And to the people who are trying to work with psychedelics within that model, I think you very quickly will find out that those models are inadequate, and you'll have to start thinking about things like nature that you haven't spent a whole lot of time on, or the body, or things that you haven't spent so much time on in psychological training. And maybe other areas of medicine will just kind of ignore and be uninterested in psychedelics because they're so unfamiliar and unpredictable in that way. I'm more skeptical and more concerned about the integration of psychedelics within capitalism. So I do think they can be objectified and compartmentalized and potentially harmful to people who are trying to use them in narrow ways without adequate supports, without adequate preparation. But within the medical model, I'm kind of excited to see what they do to the medical model. Hopefully, as researchers, we can kind of get beyond just thinking at the individual level and think about how our stance within Western culture impacts us psychologically and physically, how it impacts our well-being in all senses, and be reflective on, as we work with psychedelics and as we see people have these more holistic experiences that involve the whole person, to maybe get past what I would call our collective cultural bypass, right? So if psychedelics are about things like interconnectedness, and that comes up a lot for people. What are we doing to support people collectively? And I think the medical model, capitalist business structures are ways of kind of bypassing the more disruptive and less palatable aspects of psychedelics and retaining the things that we're more familiar with and that are more profitable. So in conclusion here, if we really listen to psychedelics and what people are telling us from those experiences and what you're having from your own experiences, I think it'll give us an opportunity to reflect on the state and the conditions of the world and how that impacts people, which might give us some complex and difficult things that we need to integrate, not just individually, but collectively. So that's my hope, is that we'll take a look at those things. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah. We do a few just for Geoff, and then we'll do some at the end. Does anyone have any questions? Well, I was interested in the cultural bypass aspects. And just what you were saying, essentially, I think, is that we enter into these experiences quite unprepared, and that's why the need for integration. Is there any way of kind of culturally preparing people? Can you see in this space?
Yeah, so culturally preparing people, and I'm a therapist as well, so I've been doing ketamine-assisted therapy for the past 8 years, have worked in harm reduction as well. And I think in harm reduction, it's a place where we often talk about the political, we talk about the context of a drug war and how that impacts people, and how the things they're experiencing aren't only a product of trauma, even though I think that's an important lens too, but they're also these systemic level traumas of incarceration and classism and racism that come into play. And so I think having conversations with clients to get them to reflect on the structural and systemic things that are impacting them. And then from there, how do we still move forward within systems that aren't necessarily going to support us moving forward? It's important to kind of be able to have both conversations, both the focus on the individual experience and suffering, but also the context of that, the bigger context. And I think that's especially effective in group settings where people can kind of see they're coming in with the same stories, the same experiences, and makes it easier to see what's mine, what's individual, and what's not, what's bigger stuff.
Maybe pass with the microphone.
Oh, yeah. Here's another one. There you go. And I can run around. Is that on? Okay.
Thank you. Just thinking about the preparation and integration model that one might study when you're studying to be a psychedelics assisted therapist. I was at ICPR on the weekend, and I saw presentations from Australia and Switzerland. And in the Australian model, it's like a 9-month psychotherapy with the psychedelics embedded within it, and I think the Swiss model is a year. So there's a lot of preparation. I think there's 6 months, maybe 6 months preparation in the Australian model before somebody would actually take psychedelic medicine, and I think something similar in maybe longer even, I don't know, in the Swiss model. But do you think that would be, I suppose, following on from what you were saying, would that therefore be helpful to have a longer preparation period, which is sometimes like a couple of sessions before the actual taking of the medicine? But in what you've been saying, it really makes sense to have that long-term preparation where these things that you speak about can be considered and integrated, and so that the mindset is in a much more receptive state, maybe, and not so that the experience isn't such an ontological shock, so it's not as shocking. I wonder what your thoughts were about that.
Definitely providing some space for preparation is important. I think the balance to strike is we make that too long, it becomes a barrier to access and entry into services, right? And so I'm usually doing 3 or 4 preparation sessions for clients who are doing ketamine-assisted therapy. One of the ways to make it easier on myself is I wrote this article so that I could provide some of my thinking and framework to clients. So I often do share it with them. But I think there are, the theoretical orientation you use is important. So I wouldn't necessarily want somebody getting 9 months of a hyper individualistic theoretical orientation. I don't necessarily think that would make them more prepared. There are theories that attempt to be more structural and political in their thinking, feminist therapies, narrative therapy, some of the multicultural therapies. So I think practicing from those introduces a way to talk about some of these contexts beyond the individual with people in their preparation. And then working with what comes out of that too is important. Yeah.
Oh, I think sorry, but we were going to have a panel at the end. I'm just going to take one question from online. Is that okay? Because so that is, could the speaker share more about what the evidence is of his claim that Indigenous communities don't have integration? What this is based on? Is this universally true or specific to certain communities? And if there are equivalent practices to integration in these communities that showed up in your paper. I think obviously we'll have a session on this, a panel later today, but if you wanted to talk from the perspective of yours.
Fine with saving that for the anthropologist. Yeah.
Okay, cool. We'll save that one for the anthropologists. So maybe one quick question, Amadeus. We have an anthropologist.
Hiya. I thought that was amazing. I thought it was brilliant. And these are things that I think about often as well. Like in the diagram, you had like the outermost circle was about systems of values, and so you're talking about capitalism and that the systems that we're embedded in are partly what contribute to making us, or some people, sick. But how do we incorporate this systems thinking into integration without being prescriptive about what value systems may be better, right? Because you potentially then fall into the trap of something like a Marxist kind of false consciousness, insofar as like, I know plenty of capitalists who are like perfectly happy and well adjusted. Not that I agree with capitalism personally, but it becomes kind of normative, right? When we're saying these values are essentially not working or bad and potentially should be avoided. So what else? Because re-envisioning a system of values, it's a huge task. It's a collective task. It's an ethical and philosophical task. But I wonder, is it like maybe an evidence-based thing that you might be working from? Like, is it something that it would, like, for example, we can see that like pro-sociality could improve mental health, but like, are there other, like, what is the basis of the re-envisioning of values?
I think if we go all the way back to Darwin, who wrote a lot more about our social nature than our competitive nature, and how that was misrepresented. I think there are plenty of things we can point to in the history of science and social sciences to provide ideas to give people more options of how they want to think about things. So I don't have a problem with introducing ideas, recognizing them as ideas, that people have the choice of whether they adopt those or not. Encouraging people to reflect on what their values are is a great thing to incorporate in therapy. And often you'll get to some of these things anyway, especially if you're able to do that collectively in group contexts. I do highly recommend, if you've ever studied community psychology, is a really great way of kind of looking at everything beyond the individual and how that contributes to our collective well-being. And so I think it's probably where the best research base is that I'm aware of and that I try to bring in. But yeah.
Okay, so to have such an interesting discussion, and we'll have to move on